America, my name is Osei-Frimpong. I'm coming to you today to talk about how America is a center-right nation, and that's not good for black people. And if you don't think America is a center-right nation, then you don't really know America. It's a center-right nation, and America is a center-right nation because the people on the far right actually have content to their politics, whereas the liberals and even a lot of the leftists, they have vacuous content. The far right, you got DeSantis out there and Ted Cruz, those guys are like, this is what should be in our schools, this is why it should be in our schools, this is the content of our education, this is the content of our culture. The liberals are like, well, I don't know, maybe science will help us. They don't actually have a political program that goes all the way down to the culture. And what does a non-center-right nation look like? What does a non-center-right nation look like in the U.S.? Well, a non-center-right nation in the U.S. looks like an honest conversation about there are some rights that actually need to challenge antecedent property rights. Because look, if there's going to be justice in the United States, if we're going to have our democratic institutions, some people who have stuff that they think is theirs and they feel entitled to be theirs, they're going to have to take a haircut. They're going to have to realize that democracy matters more than their antecedent property rights, especially a lot of white people who got their property rights by ways of terrorism. We still got like a quarter of the wealth in the United States. A quarter of the people in the United States can trace their wealth back to the Homestead Acts, where we just kind of like gave white people land and then loans for the land. And then yeah, there was an article. I want to say a quarter of the white people in the United States can trace their wealth, their family wealth, back to the Homestead Acts, right? So antecedent property rights are going to have to be massaged for the sake of democratic principles, right? That doesn't mean that property rights need to go away if we're going to be less than a center-right nation. It means that we need to have the public conversation about that there are rights that are more important than property rights, insofar as you need some sort of equality in terms of property rights and claims to external stuff and goods and services and time and resources in order to have a political democracy. That's why you can't have a democracy where one class of people owns things and the other class of people are sharecroppers, right? You need a sort of distribution of property that actually supports democracy. Right, and black people, we're going to be renting for the next few generations if there isn't some sort of distribution that happens about looking at some of these antecedent property rights and taxing the heck out of some of this inherited property of the whites. Right? So, and then also looking at reparations to secure black people assets. Right? So there are economic conditions to political democracy, and unless you're willing to have that conversation, then there's not going to be a real left politics, right? And so we're a center-right culture. Your churches are center-right. They're not telling you that we need to look at property rights and say that property rights are important, and they are very important, but they're not more important than the conditions of democracy. And how do we make sure that everybody has the economic conditions in order to participate in a democratic society, right? So yeah, and same with family rights, right? So what would it look like to actually support families, every family, not just allow them to get an abortion when they can't afford to have a kid, but actually support the realization of parenthood as a matter of right. The blessings of liberty that are talked about in our Declaration of Independence are supposed to involve all forms of liberty, which means the special quality of freedom you can only have in a family, in intimate relationships or in immediate relationships where you and the other person are one person, one flesh, right? So if you don't have the resources to get married or to have children, that is a problem for your freedom. That's the equivalent of not having the resources to vote. Right? So every time we hear someone who says well, I would get married, but I don't have the money in this economy to do it, or I would have a family, but I don't have the money to raise kids in this economy, we need to think of that as hearing someone say, well, I would vote, but I don't have money to pay the poll tax. Right? So these forms of freedom need to be just as important as property rights, and we need to start actually having them negate antecedent property rights, because there is no when I talk about reparations, I'm pretty honest with, there is no way that black people are free and the American South has the same distribution of property. Like, we're going to have to take some of their stuff. Some of the stuff they think is theirs, we're going to have to take some of the white stuff. And some of the contracts that have been in their family since their grandparent, secured the contract at a Klan meeting back in the 50s, we're going to have to take that contract. Speaking of contracts, I'm going to talk about the CHIPS Act after the opening. I'm going to hit the beat. Peace.
Sound good to me. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I'll paint the White House black and it can feature in your front.
So the CHIPS Act is an act that hit Congress, that passed the Senate yesterday, and it's going to be about $54 billion in grants, $54 billion, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, in grants, direct grants to spur American manufacturing in terms of computers. I heard Paul Pelosi made a huge bet on NVIDIA, and Paul Pelosi is Nancy Pelosi's husband. So I followed Paul Pelosi and made a little bit of money on NVIDIA because that's Black life. We're just kind of like, we have to be like parasites upon the sharks. And then I took my money out because, sharks do sometimes notice they're parasites. So the CHIPS Act is going to be $52 to $54 billion in grants, direct grants to companies that are supposed to spur American manufacturing of semiconductors and computer parts and stuff like that. And how much of that money is going to go to black people? How many black people work for NVIDIA? How many black people work for Intel? How many black people are going to see that $54 billion? That was just a gimme for the government the government decides the shape of our economy and decided that it's not interested in making sure that black people get a part of the productive infrastructure for, tech, right? So, that money might trickle down to a black guy or woman who owns a maintenance company. How many black businesses are going to get that CHIPS money? Who owns a sanitation company who might get a contract with one of the real manufacturers to clean up the office suites. Maybe. That's the closest black people are going to get to that $54 billion. And that's an entire problem, right? Because that's a problem for our democracy, because that just actually uses antecedent, structural monopolies. And, we're structurally locked out. So even if it's not a monopoly among the whites, it's functionally a monopoly into, with respect to black people being able to enter the market. We're locked out because those jobs are all going to go to cousins and people who know each other through, golfing buddies and tennis buddies, or people who went to school with one another and all that stuff. And none of that money is going to go to black people. So that becomes a problem for if you're serious about democracy, right? So we had the government, a democratically elected government, pass a bill that might be good for the American economy, GDP wise. But when white people get a lot of money, they tend to use that money to reinforce the racial hierarchy. Right? So it's not particularly good for democracy for the government to just hand out money to white people. And a few people with H-1B visas who are in the industry. Right? So we need to think about what that means and how we need to be honest about, if we're going to be anything other than a center-right nation, we need to talk about the importance of breaking up the stranglehold that non-black people have on property and these industries, and say that that's a problem for democracy. That's a problem for democracy. Look, and this isn't necessarily anti-capitalism. It's just, if we're serious about black people actually participating in capitalism, we need to have the conversation about how we are, 14% of the nation, or 12 to 14% of the nation, and 0 or 0.0001% of that CHIPS contract money. right? So like that's not anti-capitalist saying that. That's saying that capitalism is actually is predatory upon black people. And like I said, when you give non-black people a lot of money, they tend to use that money to lock black people further out, right? So it's not like a rising tide lifts all ship. No, a rising tide lifts their super yacht to come and ram our ship, right? So we need to talk about the democratic conditions that allow capitalism to also be black, right? So this isn't necessarily anti-capitalism. It is talking about you need capitalism that's subordinate to the political conditions of democracy. Because if you're economically subordinate, you can't be politically equal. If you're economically vulnerable, if we're a nation if black people as a nation are a nation of renters, and white people as a nation are a nation of owners, then we're not politically equal. Because at any point in time, like, and southern states don't have rent control. People could just sneeze and up your rent if they think you're getting too uppity. Right now, the U.S. is trying to control our spending, consumer spending, and get inflation down by raising the interest rates. What if the whites decide that black people have too much disposable power and income and do that and try to get our political power and our discretionary income by just raising our rents? What are we going to say? We'll be like the sharecroppers. We are functionally sharecroppers. Like if you're renting in these unregulated markets, you're functionally a sharecropper. And you know what the story with the sharecroppers is, at the end of the year, somehow they did not make enough money. Somehow the crops always came in below what they owed. That's going to be renting in the United States if black people get power. If the whites get nervous, they'll just say all right, well, just raise the rent so that they don't have the money to organize. Because you make no mistake, you do need money to organize. You need space and money to organize. Institutions take capital. We're in a capitalist economy. That means if black people are going to be socially and politically autonomous, they need diffuse autonomous capital. Now, we need to be able to, and not just debt, right? Because wherever 2 or 3 black people come together, there seems to be a lot of Jesus and debt. And so that's a problem with the characteristic difference between white organizations and black organizations, right? So white organizations can pool resources. Black organizations get together and find out, would you believe everyone's in debt? And what does that mean? Or, their liabilities. The only reason you're not in debt is because you don't answer your phone from your family who needs money from you. Right. So in order to make the U.S. not a center-right nation, because we are a center-right nation, we need to stop fetishizing property rights as the only kind of right. We need to stop fetishizing property rights as the only kind of right. It is one of a myriad ways of expressing freedom. So we need to respect property, but we also need to understand that antecedent property rights can't overwhelm and negate other rights claims, right? So like I said, if we're going to do reparations in the South, that means Ted Turner's going to have to give up some of his cut. He's the biggest landowner in Georgia. There is no Georgia that's made whole where Ted Turner keeps all of his land. Georgia's a third black. And so as long as we fetishize property rights and antecedent kind of contracts, like this government contract or this private contract's been in my family for 3 generations. No, if we're serious about democracy, that contract needs to get broken up and distributed to people so that they have the independence to fight you politically and socially, or to contest with you politically and socially, right? And if we're not having that conversation, then we're just a center-right nation that's just trying to conserve the antecedent structures that have kept black people being poor forever. Right. So, and that we're a center-right nation because liberals and even the left isn't really contesting the cultural aspects. They're not contesting culture makes the nation. Right. So if you have a center-right church that thinks that the government doesn't owe you freedom, if you're downtrodden, you should be able to just ask your church mates or go to a charity. That's center-right. That's center-right. Obama going to Flint and telling everyone to like have a fundraiser and pass the hat to get lead out of the water, that's center-right politics. That's center-right politics. That's not, all right, so we need to call the Army Corps of Engineers and make this a national priority and rip out these pipes that are poisoning these kids. And, let's do it. Let's go. Right? That would have been actually understanding that, the government's actually supposed to secure rights. And not just, and the leaded water that needs to be ripped out isn't just in Flint. It's all over. Everywhere there's a zip code with a congregation of black people, check the pipes and check the water. Because when, we don't spend infrastructure money securing the livelihoods of stigmatized communities. Right. And that's a problem. That's a problem. And like I said, we have a center-right culture because churches aren't calling that an abomination and a sin, which it is. It is, right? And so if we think that we can privatize some of these government responsibilities, you're just part of a center-right culture. If the right wing wants to put their content into your schools and liberals and the left doesn't have anything to say about it except well, I don't know, I guess, I don't want to tick them off, then that's functionally a center-right culture. And, I was saying this about Joe Rogan, who I don't hate. I think Joe Rogan's America. He's actually he's got some non-obvious virtues. And he's also, all he needs is one little push to be a full-blown fascist. He would be. He would be. With the right push, he would be a complete fascist because there is no counterbalance, right? So right now, like I said, he's an American. And by the way, people ask, what's a fascist? A fascist is someone who just thinks that the government should back private power, who's fine with the government backing corporate power, and not against democracy, right? So if you're good with the corporate takeover of government power, the corporate owning of police, or the police functionally doing what the corporate oligarchy wants, then you're a fascist, and that's never going to end good for black people because we don't have those kind of property rights. So the people who own things will then use the state power to kind of mop up any of your, counter-fascist movements. And the opposite of that is democratic principles that understand that there are conditions for us that need to obtain for us to actually work out our public problems as a people. All right. And the police should secure those conditions of democracy, not the conditions of corporate profit. All right. So yeah, America is very close to just being openly fascist insofar as there is no counter discourse that says actually we need democratic institutions, which is one reason why we've ultimately lost. We both won and lost the Cold War. We lost the Cold War because when Russia became more like the United States, they just became more of a fascist capitalist society. Right. So at the end of the Cold War, Russia became, we exported a market economy without exporting democratic institutions because we don't really have democratic institutions. And the South never actually has had democratic institutions. I was reading a great book by Ihorn. She just goes on to the South was always an aristocracy. It was always an aristocracy, and it never wanted to not be an aristocracy. It just wanted an aristocracy with property rights when property was included black people. Right. So we exported a market economy. We exported a market economy to Russia without exporting democratic principles. And depending on who you talk to, we kind of did the same with China, and which is why both Russia right now and the CCP, China, are both more American than America is because they are just more nakedly, they're just more nakedly capitalist without a chaser. right? Without any illusion of democratic institutions. We have the illusion of democratic institutions. We don't have real democratic institutions, which is why, we can't fight against a lot of this takeover. And we have a culture that supports our quasi-democracy. We have a culture that says that. We have a culture that says you can be free and broke at the same time. You can be free and broke at the same time. You can be free and jobless at the same time. You can be free and not be able to control your rent at the same time. As long as you think that you can both be free and at the discretion of your landlord, and you have your livelihood at the discretion of your landlord or your one single boss, then you have a very kind of vacuous understanding of freedom. Right? So this is why we need to talk about things like federal job guarantees, so that if you tick off your boss by being loud one day, you have a guaranteed job, because there are economic conditions to political freedom. So even if you are a bad worker, we will find a job for you, because for the same reason, even if you're a bad voter, we find a vote for you. You can vote, right? Because there are economic conditions to democracy, and we need to be serious about actually articulating those economic conditions for democracy. And without that, we'll just kind of fall into kind of a parochial center-right culture, which is very comfortable with keeping Black people destitute or degraded and vulnerable for generations to come. By the way, if you appreciate anything I'm doing or saying, go ahead and go to www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month, and I'll keep doing it. Yeah. All right. Take care. I will see you next week.